As soon as the will was read, a chill swept through the room. I barely had time to process the grief of losing my grandfather before my mother stood up, placed a firm hand on her husband's arm, and declared in a calm, assured voice, "From now on, Richard will take charge of the company." I blinked in disbelief. Richard? My stepfather? The man my mother had married less than a year ago? The same man who had spent the past 6 months making casual remarks about how someone my age couldn't handle true responsibility? I looked around the room. No one seemed shocked. My aunts, uncles, even a few board members, all sat in silence as if this decision had already been made. But there was one small problem with my mother's confident announcement. I own the company now. A week before the funeral, I sat beside my grandfather's hospital bed, holding his frail hand. "Mia, you're the only one I trust," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. Tears welled up in my eyes. Throughout my life, Grandpa was the only person who ever truly believed in me. My mother, on the other hand, had always made it clear that I was a disappointment. "Don't let them take what I built," he said, his grip tightening slightly. "They will try, and when they do, don't be afraid. I've prepared everything." I didn't fully understand his words then. Not yet. Now, as the lawyer cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses, my mother eagerly looked to him, waiting for confirmation that her husband would take over Grandpa's empire. Instead, the lawyer looked at me. According to Mr. Whitmore's will, his entire estate, including all shares in Whitmore Industries, has been left to his granddaughter, Mia Whitmore. A deafening silence followed. I could feel every eye in the room on me. "That must be a mistake," my mother said, her voice sharp. "He meant to leave it to me." The lawyer remained unfazed. "I assure you there is no mistake. Mia is the sole heir, effective immediately. She owns the company." Richard was the first to react, letting out a soft laugh as though this were some kind of joke. "Sweetheart, you can't be serious," he said, looking at me as though I were a child playing dress-up. "A business this size requires real experience. It's not a school project." I remained silent, observing them. Then, as if the lawyer's words finally hit her, my mother's face contorted with fury. "If that's how it is," she spat, "then leave our house immediately." I stared at her, confused. "Our house?" I couldn't help but laugh. "You mean Grandpa's house," I said, shaking my head. "You might want to read that will a little more carefully, Mom, because I have a feeling there's another surprise waiting for you." The silence in the room grew unbearable. My mother's face had gone pale with rage, her lips pressed tightly together as if she were fighting to hold back a scream. Richard, standing beside her, kept glancing back and forth between me and the lawyer, his confidence beginning to falter. I had expected resistance, but not this quickly. "You're joking," my mother finally hissed, her voice low but venomous. "Grandpa would never do this. He would never leave you in charge over me." The lawyer calmly adjusted his papers. Mr. Whitmore made his intentions very clear. Mia is the sole beneficiary of his estate, including his home, all financial assets, and 100% of Whitmore Industries shares. I barely had time to absorb it. I had known about the company, but the house, the entire estate, everything? My mother must have realized it at the same time because her expression darkened. "If that's the case," she snapped, her voice cold and controlled, "then you are no longer welcome in this house. Pack your things and leave immediately." The room fell even quieter. It almost felt surreal. Did she really just kick me out of my own home? I exhaled slowly, trying not to laugh again. "Mom, I think you've misunderstood something. This house, it's mine now. Grandpa left it to me." Her face twitched as if she couldn't grasp the words. "That's absurd," she replied. "This is our family home. And now I'm the only legal family member who owns it," I shot back. Richard finally intervened, forcing a condescending smile. "Mia, sweetheart," he said in that patronizing tone, "you're young. You don't understand the weight of running a business like this. It's more than just an inheritance. It's a responsibility. Your mother and I have years of experience. Let us help you. There was the real plan. This wasn't about family, it was about control. They had expected the company to go to my mother, who would then hand it over to Richard. He'd take charge and I'd be pushed aside. But instead, the only person standing in his way was me, and he thought he could charm me into giving it up. I crossed my arms and stood firm, refusing to look away. Let me get this straight. The moment you realized you weren't getting the company, Mom tried to kick me out of my own home, and now you're saying you should be the one to run everything? Do you think I'm stupid? Richard's face flushed, but he kept his fake smile. That's not what I'm saying at all. I just think. No, I interrupted. I think I understand perfectly. You assumed Grandpa would leave everything to Mom. You two were probably already planning how to take over. But the thing is, Grandpa saw right through you. That's why he left it all to me. My mother slammed her hand on the table, her anger giving way to desperation. Mia, you don't know what you're doing, she snapped. This is a billion-dollar industry. It takes more than a lucky inheritance to run something this big. The lawyer cleared his throat. Actually, Mr. Whitmore had already put measures in place to ensure a smooth transition for Mia. My mother whipped her head toward him. What measures? The lawyer adjusted his glasses. Mr. Whitmore knew Mia might need guidance, so he appointed a trusted team of advisors to oversee operations while she transitions into her new role as CEO. The board has already been notified and all legal documents have been finalized. A wave of relief washed over me. Grandpa had planned for this. He knew they would try to manipulate me, so he made sure I wouldn't be alone. Richard's face darkened. His polite act was slipping. He leaned toward my mother, lowering his voice, but I still heard him. We can fight this. The lawyer shook his head. You cannot. The will is airtight. There's nothing to contest. I watched as my mother's last ounce of control shattered. She had spent years belittling me, treating me like an afterthought, a disappointment. She had never imagined a world where she wasn't in charge. And now she had nothing. She looked at me like I had personally betrayed her, like I had stolen something from her. You're making a mistake, she finally said, her voice trembling with anger. You think this is a victory? Running a company isn't a game, Mia. You'll fail. I stared at her, letting her words sink in. Then with a slow, deliberate smile, I leaned forward. I guess we'll see, won't we? The tension in the room was unbearable. My mother's glare drilled into me, her perfectly manicured fingers curling into fists on the polished oak table. Richard sat stiffly beside her, his jaw clenched as if he were holding back a tirade. I could almost hear their thoughts. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. I had been the inconvenient obstacle in their perfect plan, the naive girl they could push aside, the easy target they could manipulate. But Grandpa had seen through them, and that's why he had chosen me. This doesn't make sense, my mother finally said, her voice shaking with rage. Dad would never do this to me. I was his only daughter. Why would he cut me out of everything? I turned to the lawyer, wondering the same thing. Grandpa and I had always been close, but even I hadn't expected him to leave her with nothing. The lawyer sighed, folding his hands on the table. Mr. Whitmore left a letter explaining his decision. He instructed that I read it in the event of any confusion. He pulled a sealed envelope from his briefcase and carefully opened it. I watched my mother shift uneasily in her seat. Mia, the lawyer began reading aloud, if you're hearing this, it means I'm gone. By now I'm sure your mother is outraged. She'll call this unfair. She'll claim she was supposed to inherit everything. But the truth is she lost that right a long time ago. I glanced at my mother, her lips pressed tightly together, her face unreadable. Your mother always thought money meant power, the lawyer continued, but she never understood that power requires responsibility. When she was younger, I gave her chance after chance to prove herself worthy of running the family business. Instead, she spent decades taking shortcuts, choosing luxury over leadership, selfishness over sacrifice. The lawyer paused and then continued reading. She always believed that being my daughter entitled her to my fortune. But entitlement isn't the same as earning something. As for Richard, if he's in the room right now, I imagine he's trying to hide his true colors. But I know what he is. A leech, a man who saw an opportunity in my daughter's bank account and took it. I won't let my life's work fall into his hands. Richard's face turned beet red. I could see his rage building, but he remained silent. Mia, you are different, the letter continued. You never expected anything from me, and that's exactly why I chose you. You worked hard. You learned. You respected the business for what it is. A legacy, not just a cash machine. I watched you grow, and I knew you were the only one. I could trust myself to carry forward what I had built. My heart raced as I thought of all those summers the first had spent with Grandpa in the office, taking notes and asking questions, while my mother dismissed my curiosity as a mere childhood phase. But Grandpa had been paying attention. I know this won't be easy, the letter read. Your mother will try to fight you. Richard will try to control you. But remember this, I didn't leave you alone. I left you the tools to win. The lawyer finished reading, folding the letter neatly and placing it back in the envelope. A heavy silence filled the room. My mother, trembling with humiliation and anger, spat. This is ridiculous. He was old. He was sick. He wasn't thinking clearly when he wrote that will. Actually, the lawyer replied calmly, Mr. Whitmore updated his will only 3 months ago. He was of sound mind, and legally there's nothing you can do to contest it. Richard stood up abruptly, pushing his chair back. We're wasting time here. Let's go. But my mother didn't move. She was still staring at me, coldly asking, You really think you can handle all of this? You think you're ready for it? I met her gaze. Yes. That night, sleep barely came. I wasn't exactly scared, but the magnitude of it all. Owning an empire overnight, becoming CEO before my 25th birthday, was overwhelming. But Grandpa believed in me, and that faith was the only thing that kept me steady. The next morning, I arrived at the company headquarters for my first official board meeting since the will was read. Grandpa's trusted advisors were waiting for me, just as he promised. I wasn't alone. But as I stepped out of my car, a familiar voice called out, Mia. I turned to see my mother and Richard standing at the entrance, their expressions carefully neutral. We need to talk, my mother said smoothly. Just the three of us. No lawyers. No board members. Just family. I knew this wasn't about family. It was their last attempt to get what they wanted, and I wasn't going to let them win. I studied them both as they stood there at the entrance to my company's headquarters. They had lost the legal battle. The will was unshakable. They couldn't take the company by force, so now they were trying to negotiate. I knew this conversation wasn't casual. It was their last shot at control. We need to talk, my mother repeated, her tone unervingly calm. I took a slow breath. I wasn't afraid anymore. Talk, I said flatly. Richard glanced around, lowering his voice. Not here. Somewhere private. I should have walked away. I should have ignored them completely. But something in me wanted to hear them out, to see what desperate move they'd make next. I nodded. Fine. 5 minutes. We ended up in a small conference room inside the building. Richard sat down like he belonged there while my mother stood, arms crossed, watching me like a hawk. You're in over your head, Mia, she began, her voice softer now, almost gentle. Grandpa put an impossible burden on you. It's not fair to expect you to run a billion-dollar empire at your age. I smirked. And you think Richard should run it instead? Yes, she replied without hesitation. At least for now. He has leadership experience. You could learn from him. I laughed softly, shaking my head. You mean I should sign everything over to him and step aside like a good little girl? Richard leaned forward, his smile rehearsed. Not exactly. We're proposing a partnership. I raised an eyebrow. Go on. You'll still be the face of the company, he said. You'll still have your title. But I'll handle the actual operations. You won't have to deal with the pressure. No board meetings, no tough decisions. You can just enjoy your life. I stared at him. You want me to be a figurehead? It's the best arrangement, my mother added. The board will feel more comfortable and you won't have to bear the stress of making mistakes. You're still so young, Mia. You could ruin everything Grandpa built with one wrong decision. There it was. Manipulation, fear tactics, and subtle insults disguised as concern. I leaned back in my chair. And what do I get out of this? I asked. Richard smiled as if he had just won a huge prize. We'll transfer a percentage of the company's revenue into your personal account every month. You'll never have to worry about money. You can live however you want. Travel, enjoy life, and the company stays successful. It was almost impressive how confident he was in this plan. They truly thought I'd just roll over and let them take control. I pretended to consider it. And what happens if I say no? My mother's expression darkened. Mia, don't be reckless. You'll have enemies, she said carefully. The board doesn't trust you. The shareholders will question every move you make. If you refuse to work with us, we won't protect you from that pressure. I tilted my head. You mean you'll sabotage me? Richard smirked, not bothering to deny it. I exhaled slowly, then stood up. Thanks for the offer, but I'll take my chances. My mother shot up from her chair. Mia, don't do this. I turned toward the door, but she grabbed my wrist. Do you really think you can win? She hissed. You don't understand how this world works. You think Grandpa did you a favor by handing you this company? No, he put a target on your back. The board will eat you alive. The investors will bury you. You need us. I stared at her. No, Mom, I said quietly. I needed you when I was a kid. I needed you to believe in me. But you never did. You wanted me to fail so you could take what wasn't yours. But I'm not a scared little girl anymore. She flinched just slightly. Richard stood up, his patience clearly running out. You're making a huge mistake, Mia. Don't come crying to us when it all blows up in your face. I smiled. I won't. And then I walked out, leaving them behind for good. I knew they wouldn't give up easily. The moment I walked away from my mother and Richard, I could feel it in my bones. They were planning something. And I was right. The first attack came 2 days later. I walked into my first official board meeting as CEO, expecting resistance. But I wasn't ready for the full-scale assault waiting for me. The moment I took my seat at the head of the long mahogany table, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The board members, mostly men in their 50s and 60s who had worked under my grandfather for decades, looked at me with barely concealed skepticism. Before I could even greet them, Mr. Holloway leaned forward with a tight expression. Mia, before we begin, I think we need to address the elephant in the room. I set my hands on the table. And what elephant would that be? He exchanged glances with a few others as if seeking approval, then spoke. Your grandfather was a brilliant man, but let's be honest. He made an impulsive decision putting you in charge. You don't have the qualifications. You don't have the experience. And frankly, we're concerned. I kept my expression neutral. I had expected this, but hearing it stated so openly still made my chest tighten. Concerned about what? I asked. Your ability to lead, Mr. Langston chimed in, checking his phone casually. Then, letting out a small sigh, he muttered just loud enough for everyone to hear. The media's already caught wind of the transition. The headlines aren't flattering. My stomach dropped. I reached for my phone and discreetly pulled up the news. The headlines hit me like a punch to the gut. Whitmore Empire falls into inexperienced hands. Can the A's handle it? Corporate gamble. 25-year-old Mia Whitmore takes over billion-dollar company. Insiders predict collapse of Whitmore Industries under new CEO. My pulse spiked, but I forced myself to stay calm. This wasn't an accident. It was sabotage, and I had a strong suspicion who was behind it. By the time the meeting ended, the company's PR team had called me 3 times. I locked the door to my office and finally listened to their frantic messages. Mia, the media firestorm is growing. We need a response. Investors are nervous. Stocks dipped 3% this morning. We suspect someone inside the company leaked damaging statements about your inexperience. The board is already discussing an alternative leadership plan. I clenched my jaw. Alternative leadership plan could only mean one thing: a coup. I checked my email. Sure enough, there was already a formal request for a leadership vote to reassess the company's direction under its new leadership. Richard and my mother were behind this. They had fed the media the story that I was too young, too incapable. They'd whispered in the ears of nervous investors, and now they were trying to push me out before I even had a chance to prove myself. I should have panicked. I should have felt defeated. But instead I smiled because I had been preparing for this. I picked up my phone and dialed the one person who could help me turn things around. The phone rang twice before I heard a smooth, familiar voice. I was wondering when you'd call, he said. I sighed in relief. I need your help, I said. Lucas Sinclair, my grandfather's most trusted business partner, a financial genius, and the man who had once turned a failing company into a billion-dollar empire overnight. More importantly, he despised my mother and Richard just as much as I did. I assume this is about the media circus? He asked, amusement in his voice. You assume correctly. The board is sharpening their knives. They're holding a vote in 2 days. Ah, he hummed, classic corporate betrayal. Well then, Mia, it's time we remind them why your grandfather chose you. That night, I met Lucas in his private office. A sleek, glass-walled space overlooking the city skyline. He studied me carefully before smirking. Not scared? Good. Then let's crush them. Over the next few hours we devised a strategy. First, the board meeting trap. Lucas would gather key investors who still believed in my grandfather's vision, and they would publicly endorse me before the vote. Second, the media takeover. I would sit for an exclusive interview to counter the negative press, showcasing my qualifications and revealing my grandfather's own words about why he chose me. Third, we would expose the sabotage. Lucas had the connections to trace exactly who had leaked the damaging stories. If Richard or my mother were behind it, we'd expose them. By the time we finished, it was nearly midnight. I stood, shaking Lucas's hand. Thank you for this. Don't thank me yet, he grinned. Wait until we see their faces when they realize you're not so easy to get rid of. The next morning the headlines were different. CEO Mia Whitmore breaks silence. Exclusive interview set to air tonight, read one. Whitmore Industries stock stabilizes as investors show support, said another. Who's really behind the smear campaign? Sources say corporate backstabbing at play. I sat at my desk, watching as the tide began to turn in my favor. But I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over yet. Richard and my mother weren't just going to sit back and watch their plan fail. They would fight dirty, and I had to be ready for their next move. The morning of the board vote arrived. I stood outside the massive glass doors of Whitmore Industries, gazing up at the towering building that was now mine. Today would decide everything. Either I would prove my grandfather made the right choice, or I would be forced out before I ever had the chance to lead. And I knew one thing: Richard and my mother wouldn't play fair. The boardroom was packed, every seat filled with powerful men and women, most of whom had been loyal to my grandfather for decades. At the head of the table sat Mr. Holloway, the same board member who had questioned my leadership just days before. We'll begin with a vote, he announced. As many of you know, concerns have been raised about Mia Whitmore's ability to lead this company. Several members have proposed an alternative leadership plan, which we will now discuss. The doors opened and Richard and my mother walked in. I wasn't surprised. They had been planning this moment all along. Richard cleared his throat, acting as if he were already in charge. Ladies and gentlemen, let's be honest. Running this company requires years of experience, he said, throwing me a fake smile. And as much as we all respect Mia, we must prioritize what's best for the company. I watched him pace, giving a well-rehearsed speech. I have the experience. I know the company. I have a strong vision for the future. That's why I'm proposing I take over as CEO, while Mia remains involved as a figurehead, the public face of Whitmore Industries. He sat down, smug as if the deal was already done. I let the silence hang for a moment before I spoke. It's funny, Richard, I said, keeping my voice calm, because I remember you saying something very different in your private conversations. His face twitched. Excuse me. I turned to Lucas, who was sitting beside me. He placed a folder on the table and slid it toward the board members. In the past week, Richard and my mother have been working behind the scenes to sabotage Mia's leadership. But they didn't just leak false stories to the press. They also attempted to undermine the company itself. The board members opened the folder. Inside were emails, text messages, and call transcripts proving that Richard had been actively contacting competitors, attempting to negotiate deals that would weaken Whitmore Industries' market position. Mr. Holloway's face darkened as he read. "What is this?" he demanded. "Proof," Lucas said smoothly. "Proof that Richard has been working against the company's interests. He didn't want to save the company, he wanted to use it for his own gain." Richard's face turned white. "This is outrageous. You can't prove." "Oh, but we can," I interrupted. "We also traced the media leaks, and guess what? The source came from a private email registered under Richard's name." The boardroom erupted in murmurs. My mother stood up sharply, glaring at me. "Mia, enough," she snapped. "You're being ridiculous. You're just trying to make him look bad because you're scared." I smiled. "I don't have to make him look bad, Mom. He did that all on his own." She opened her mouth to argue, but Mr. Holloway slammed his hand on the table. "That's enough," he said coldly. He turned to Richard, his expression filled with disgust. "You were actively plotting against this company while pretending to be its savior. That alone disqualifies you from any leadership position." I leaned back, watching the panic spread across Richard's face. For the first time he realized he had lost. "It's time to vote," Mr. Holloway said sharply. The board members exchanged glances, then one by one they raised their hands in my favor. The final count was unanimous. I was officially recognized as the rightful CEO of Whitmore Industries. I exhaled, my chest feeling lighter than it had in weeks. It was over. Security escorted Richard out of the building within the hour, and my mother followed him, humiliated. "You'll regret this, Mia," she whispered before leaving. I didn't respond. I knew the truth. The only thing I regretted was trusting her for as long as I had. Later that night, Lucas joined me in my office, a satisfied smirk on his face. "You did good, kid," he said. "Your grandfather would be proud." I smiled. "Thanks, Lucas. For everything." "Don't mention it," he said, standing and stretching. "Now go celebrate, you earned it." 1 year after taking over the company, I stood at a podium addressing a packed audience. When my grandfather chose me to run Whitmore Industries, many people doubted me. They said I was too young, too inexperienced. I glanced down at the business magazine in front of me, its bold headline reading, "Mia Whitmore, the CEO who proved them all wrong." But what they didn't realize, I continued, is that success isn't about age. It's about preparation, perseverance, and the ability to rise when people expect you to fall. The crowd applauded and I smiled because I had won, and I had built my own legacy.